Here's a question for you. What's the connection between Lars von Trier's Antichrist and Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead? Well, they're both set in spooky woodlands. They're both about evil. And they are both, to some extent, spam in a cabin horror movies. But more importantly, they've both been accused of being obscene. Antichrist by some critics and newspapers, The Evil Dead by British courts. Now, this month sees the 50th anniversary of the Obscene Publications Act, which defines obscenity legally as a tendency to deprave and corrupt. Now, since 1977, films have been seen as publications which fall under the OPA. And a film is obscene if it has a tendency to deprave and corrupt a significant proportion of its likely audience. And if it fulfills that criteria, it cannot be classified by the BBFC. Now, historians looking back on the 40 years of the Obscene Publications Act will remember the Lady Chatterley trial, they'll remember the Oz trial. Film fans will think of things like the not too distant case against Crash, in which a newspaper argued that Crash was obscene, that it would make its audience morally bad. Well, a leading QC argued that this was not the case. Or further back, the case of the video nasties in the early 1980s, in which people who were distributing horror titles were hauled through the courts under the OPA. And at the centre of that was The Evil Dead. Some courts found The Evil Dead effectively guilty of OPA infringements. Others found it not guilty. And it's one of the great problems with the OPA is obviously it's open to interpretation. Who can define what actually makes somebody morally bad? Now, for a long time, I was a great critic of the OPA. I said we should repeal it. You cannot legislate for what films do to their audience. Who can say whether a film will make somebody good or bad? All you can do is legislate about what a film did to the people that made it. Did it involve the abuse of children? Did it involve the abuse of adults? Did it involve the abuse of animals? These things we can legislate about, but you cannot legislate about what a work of art will do to its audience. But if you take away the OPA, the question is this: what do you have instead? And the obvious answer is a checklist. And believe me, there are people that want a checklist of things that cannot be done, that are obscene by their very nature. In fact, a major tabloid newspaper recently printed a checklist of things that are in Antichrist: genital mutilation, real sex. It said, in fact, that Antichrist ticked all the boxes for the kind of film that we should find morally repugnant. And when you look at that kind of checklist, and then you look at the OPA, which demands that a work be taken as a whole, not individual scenes, but as a whole, and says, will this actually have a bad effect on the audience? Which is preferable? So perhaps when you look at the alternative, after all these years of complaining, as it turns 50, it's time for me to say, hey, happy birthday, OPA.